My wife planned to destroy me in the divorce, but she didn't know I had already prepared everything. "You need to stop working so hard, Nathan. I'm worried about you." She said that while straightening my shirt collar, eyes fixed on mine, her voice as soft as it had always been. And I believed her. For 3 years, I believed every word that came out of that mouth. Her name is Diana, Diana Caldwell, my wife, the woman for whom I bought a house, signed refinancing agreements, turned down promotions to be present, to build something I thought was real. My name is Nathan Hale. I'm a contracts analyst. I spend my days reading between the lines, hidden clauses, deviations disguised as bureaucracy, legal traps that look like protection but are in reality knives pointed at whoever signs without reading. I identify fraud before it happens. It's what I do. It's who I am. But there is a cruel irony when the man who sees fraud everywhere is the last one to see it inside his own home. At that moment, while Diana was straightening my collar and looking at me with that expression of genuine concern, something in the universe already knew what I didn't know yet. And that thing, that silent force that moves the pieces before we notice, was about to show me. Some stories begin with an explosion. Mine began with a cell phone forgotten on the bathroom sink. It was an ordinary Wednesday. I had arrived home early from the office, a last-minute hearing cancellation. Diana wasn't home yet. I came in, dropped my bag on the couch, went to the kitchen to get some water. I passed by the bathroom and saw her phone face down, near the faucet. I didn't touch it. It wasn't my habit to go through her things. But the screen lit up on its own, and I saw the name, Melissa. Melissa Grant, my coworker. The woman who, over the past few months, had gotten close to me with a surgical friendliness, always with a word of comfort when I mentioned how exhausted I was by the marriage, always with a knowing smile when I vented about the tensions at home. I treated her like an ally. She listened to me like someone collecting information. The message on Diana's screen was short. I only managed to read the end before it went dark. "He won't suspect anything until it's too late." I stood still, motionless, the glass of water in my hand. Here, if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. Leave a like and comment where you're watching from, because what comes next changes everything. My first instinct was to grab the phone. My second instinct, the professional one, the one that pays my bills, said, "Don't touch anything." I took a deep breath. I set the glass on the sink carefully, making no sound, as if the silence could protect me from what I had just seen. I left the bathroom, went to the couch, sat down, and started to think. Because when you spend years analyzing fraudulent contracts, you learn one thing above all else. Whoever acts on impulse loses. Whoever documents, observes, waits for the exact right moment, that's who wins. In the weeks that followed, I started piecing together what had been happening right in front of me without my seeing it. Diana had accumulated debts I knew nothing about, loans in my name, credit cards opened with my forged signature, an amount that came close to $200,000. She was suffocating, and instead of telling me she had found a more convenient way out, destroy me before I found out. The plan was elegant. I had to admit that. First, destabilize my mental health, create conflict situations, isolate me emotionally, make me seem unstable to friends, family, colleagues. Melissa, from my own office, would be the key witness to this supposed breakdown. Then, file for a contentious divorce using that history against me, force the sale of the house under unfavorable conditions. There was already an identified buyer connected to Melissa who would pay below market value, and before the asset division was formalized, the assets would disappear into accounts I would never be able to trace. It was the kind of scheme I would analyze in a corporate contract and identify in 40 minutes. Inside my own marriage, it had taken 3 years to see the first sign. But now I could see, and once you see, there's no way to stop seeing. The question wasn't whether I was going to act. The question was when and how. Because confronting Diana at that moment would mean throwing everything away. She would erase the traces, Melissa would disappear with the evidence, and I'd be left with my word against theirs. A man alone, seemingly disturbed, against 2 women with a narrative already built. No, I wasn't going to do that. I was going to do something much harder, pretend I didn't know anything. And whoever wants to know what happens when a man trained to identify fraud decides to turn the game inside out, using the very weapons that were pointed at him, needs to keep watching. Because from here on out, every step Diana and Melissa took believing they were in control was a step I had already anticipated. During the days that followed, I became an actor. Not the kind who cries on stage and receives applause. The quiet kind who smiles at dinner, asks how the day went, puts his hand on his wife's shoulder, and on the inside is cataloging every detail as evidence. "You seem more relaxed," Diana said one evening while serving the pasta. "I'm glad." "I'm trying," I replied. And I smiled the way she needed to see. On the inside, I was building a file. The first thing I did was buy a compact recorder. The kind used in forensic work, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket. I also installed an automatic backup software on the home server that Diana didn't even know existed. Every time she connected her phone to the home Wi-Fi, the traffic metadata was logged. Not the content of the messages, that would be illegal and I knew it, but the times, the frequency, the communication patterns, enough to build a timeline. At the same time, I began reviewing all of the marriage's financial documents, 3 years of statements, contracts, refinancing agreements. What I found brought me to my knees, not from weakness, but from technical astonishment. Diana had been meticulous, signatures forged with surgical precision, loans split into amounts below the mandatory bank reporting threshold, accounts opened at different institutions, geographically dispersed. She hadn't done this alone. Melissa had access to contract templates from our office. I remembered one afternoon, months ago, when she asked me to review a hypothetical case, a scheme of asset dissipation in a contentious divorce. I had explained every step in detail. I had even drawn the flow on a napkin. I had taught Melissa exactly how to destroy me. I swallowed that, filed it away, kept going. At work, I maintained my routine. I greeted Melissa every morning with the same nod as always. She responded with that calibrated smile, not too cold, not too close. Professional. I observed the micro details. The way she averted her gaze a second longer than normal, the way she turned her body slightly when I approached her desk, as if she needed to protect her computer screen. She was afraid I knew, which meant she knew there was something to be discovered. On a Thursday, I went to the filing room to retrieve an old contract and passed by Melissa's desk unintentionally. She was on the phone, speaking low, and I heard only 3 words before she noticed my presence and ended the call. "When he signs." She looked at me, smiled. "Sorry, difficult client." "I understand," I said. "We all go through that." I went back to my office, closed the door, and wrote in my field notebook, which I internally called the dossier. The 3 words, the time, the context. A small piece. But every construction begins with small pieces. It was that same week that Diana began phase 2 of their plan. She came home on a Friday with her eyes slightly red. Not from crying. Diana didn't cry easily, I knew that. It was makeup worked to simulate the effect. She sat on the edge of the bed while I was reading and stayed silent long enough for me to ask what was wrong. "I don't know if I'm okay, Nathan." "What happened?" "Nothing specific, it's just..." She paused, ran her hand through her hair. "Sometimes I feel like we're in different places, that you don't see me anymore." It was the classic preparatory script for an emotional distance allegation. I knew this because I had seen that argument in at least 12 contentious divorce cases that had crossed my desk over the years. First, you plant the narrative of emotional neglect. Then you have witnesses who confirm you tried to save the marriage. Then you file the petition as the victim. I breathed, set the book aside, looked at her with as much presence as I could manufacture. "Tell me what you're feeling." And she did. For 40 minutes, she presented me with a version of the two of us that I barely recognized. An absent husband, obsessed with work, who had gradually closed his emotional doors. Every sentence was surgically true enough to sound real, but twisted to make me responsible for a marriage that was, according to her, falling apart. I listened to everything, agreed where it was strategic, apologized for things I never did, suggested we start couples therapy. She accepted immediately, which told me everything. The therapy wasn't to save the marriage. It was to have a mental health professional who, later, could be called upon to describe my emotional state. That night, after Diana fell asleep, I went to the home office, opened the dossier, and wrote a single line at the top of the new page. She accepted therapy too quickly. It was 2 in the morning. Down the hall, I could hear Diana's calm breathing in the bedroom. And somewhere on the other side of the city, Melissa was probably sleeping soundly, convinced the plan was going perfectly. They were both wrong. Because while they were building a trap for me, I was already building one for them. Every therapy session would be documented. Every allegation of Diana's would be answered with records she didn't even know existed. And the sale of the house, that final move, the asset diversion before the division, I had already begun to neutralize in a way they wouldn't be able to undo without incriminating themselves. But before all of that, there was one piece I needed to fit into place. One piece of evidence that would turn a solid file into an irrefutable case. And that piece of evidence was about to deliver itself into my hands. The evidence arrived on a Tuesday morning, inside an ordinary envelope with no return address. I was at the office when the receptionist brought in the day's mail. Among reports and client notifications, there was a white, letter-sized envelope with my name written by hand. I opened it carefully, using disposable gloves that I had begun carrying in my suit jacket pocket 2 weeks earlier. A new habit, discreet, that no one had noticed. Inside were 3 printed sheets. They were screenshots of a conversation between Diana and Melissa. Someone had printed them, placed them in an envelope, and delivered them anonymously to my office's reception desk. I didn't know who. To this day, I'm not certain. But I read every line twice before storing the sheets inside my jacket, close to my chest, as if they were fragile. They weren't fragile. They were devastating. The conversation covered a period of 4 months. Diana and Melissa had planned every step with a coldness that impressed me even after everything I already knew. There were explicit references to the buyer of the house, a man named Derek Sohn, a real estate broker with documented ties to Melissa who would make a below-market offer in exchange for a commission agreed upon between the 3 parties. There was mention of the loans in my name, with the exact phrase, "He'll never review the smaller statements." There was, at the end of one of the messages, a sentence I had to read 3 times to believe. When the process is underway, the therapist will confirm the instability pattern. Melissa already knows what to observe at the office. So that was it. Melissa wasn't just a financial accomplice. She was the planted witness. Every time I vented to her in the hallway, every time I mentioned exhaustion or pressure, she was building a profile that would be presented in court as that of an emotionally unstable man, incapable of managing assets, prone to irrational decisions. I closed my office door, sat down, looked out the window for a long moment, and then I did something no one would expect of a man who had just read the evidence of his own planned destruction. I smiled. Because they had made the mistake every fraudster makes when they feel too secure. They had put everything in writing. That afternoon, I quietly called a lawyer I knew outside my usual professional circle, a man named Gerald Marsh, a specialist in family law and financial crimes, with a reputation for being relentless and discreet. We met at a cafe 12 blocks from the office. I brought the dossier. I brought the 3 sheets from the envelope. I brought the bank statements I had compiled, the metadata records, the time and behavior notes. Gerald stayed silent for nearly 10 minutes reading everything. Then he adjusted his glasses and said, "Nathan, you know most men in this situation would have confronted their wife in the first week." "I know. And you know what would have happened if you had." "I would have lost everything." He nodded slowly. "What do you want to do now?" "I want to let their plan reach the execution point. I want Diana to file for divorce. I want Derek Sohn to make the offer on the house. I want Melissa to show up as a witness. I want every piece to be in place before anyone realizes the board has flipped." Gerald looked at me for a long moment. "That requires nerve." "I have nerve. It also requires you to keep living with her without showing anything. I've already been doing that for weeks." He closed the folder. "Then let's get to work." In the weeks that followed, Gerald and I built an invisible legal structure around the assets. The house became the subject of a legal instrument that made any contentious sale immediately blockable through a simple petition, a clause legitimately inserted in an update to the property record that Diana never read. because Diana never read documents I signed. That was her pattern. That pattern now worked against her. The loans in my name were formally reported to the bank with signature forgery documentation, not publicly, not in a way that would reach Diana's ears, but recorded, dated, with a protocol number. A bomb with a legal timer. And then I had to do the hardest part of the entire process. I had to keep being the husband Diana thought she was manipulating. I went to the couples therapy sessions with Dr. Alan Forsyth, a serious, honest man who clearly had no idea he was being used as a piece in a scheme. I answered the questions carefully. I acknowledged real flaws, small ones, the kind any marriage has. Never exaggerating, never seeming defensive. Forsyth, in his notes, which I knew could be subpoenaed in court, was recording a stable, reflective man willing to engage in dialogue, the exact opposite of what Diana needed him to record. In one of the sessions, Diana tried to introduce the emotional instability argument. She spoke about nights I stayed at the office late, about my obsession with work, about moments when she felt I was somewhere else. Forsyth looked at me. I replied calmly, "She's right that I dedicate a lot to work. It's an area I need to improve. But I want to be here. I want this to work." Diana smiled, a smile she thought was one of victory. Forsyth wrote something down. I never knew exactly what, but from his neutral expression, I knew Diana's narrative hadn't landed the way she expected. It was on a night driving home after one of those sessions that Diana made the second major mistake. She left the laptop open in the kitchen while she went to get something from the bedroom. The screen was active, with an email window visible. I didn't move closer, but from the angle where I was standing, by the refrigerator, I could read the subject line of the open message. Final timeline, D&M, Diana and Melissa. The execution was scheduled. They were on the final timeline. I opened the refrigerator, grabbed a water bottle, closed it carefully. When Diana came back to the kitchen, I was sitting on the island stool, flipping through an old magazine as if the world were completely normal. "Want some tea?" she asked. "I'd love some," I said. She turned her back to the kettle, and I looked at the back of her head, at that woman who had shared my bed, my table, my life, and felt something that wasn't anger. It was clarity, the cold, absolute clarity of someone who knows exactly what is going to happen and is simply waiting for the right moment to let it happen. Everything was ready. The dossier was complete. The legal blocks were armed. Gerald was on standby. The bank forgery records were filed and secured. The screenshots from the anonymous envelope had been authenticated by a private expert. Only one thing remained, letting Diana and Melissa take the first official step, letting them cross the line, because on the other side of that line, there was no going back, and they were about to cross it. Gerald's call came on a Monday at 8 in the morning. "She filed," he said. Just that. I was in my car, in the office parking lot, coffee still warm in my hand. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. When? Friday night. Contentious divorce, allegation of emotional instability and marital neglect. Her lawyer has already contacted the property registry requesting an appraisal of the house for asset division. Derek Sohn would be positioned to make his offer as soon as the appraisal came through. Melissa was already prepared to testify as a witness to the supposed emotional breakdown she had observed at the office. The final timeline was in motion. "Gerald," I said, "you can activate everything now." "With pleasure." That same morning, while I walked into the office and greeted Melissa with the same nod as always, Gerald simultaneously filed 3 documents. The first, an immediate challenge to the divorce proceedings on the grounds of documented financial fraud, including the loans with forged signatures and the house undervaluation scheme. The second, a criminal complaint to the prosecutor's office with the bank records, the authenticated screenshots, and the complete timeline I had built over weeks. The third, a preventive judicial freeze on any real estate transaction involving our home address, effective immediately. In less than 4 hours, the plan that Diana and Melissa had spent months building was legally frozen. I worked through the entire morning as if it were an ordinary day. I answered emails, reviewed contracts, had a second coffee. At noon, I went to the conference room to retrieve a document and found Melissa in the hallway, phone in hand, with an expression I had never seen on her before. Disorientation. She was reading something on the screen. She looked up when she saw me, and for the first time in months, the calibrated smile didn't appear on cue. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yes," she said too quickly. "Everything's fine." I kept walking, but I knew she had been notified. Her name was in the criminal complaint filed that morning. The mask had begun to crack. That afternoon, Diana called me. Her voice was different. Not the usual soft tone, nor the victim tone rehearsed for the sessions with Forsyth. It was a voice I had never heard from her. Raw. Unraveling. "Nathan, I need to talk to you. Today. At home." "Of course," I said. "I'll be there at 7. I arrived at 7 on the dot. Diana was in the living room, sitting on the sofa we had bought together at a furniture store in Portland 3 years earlier on a Saturday afternoon when she had laughed a lot because I couldn't decide between 2 shades of gray. Melissa was beside her. I wasn't surprised. It was exactly what I expected. "Nathan," Diana stood up. "There's an explanation for all of this." I set my key on the entry table, took off my jacket, sat down in the armchair across from both of them with the calm of a man who had slept well every night while they hadn't. "I'm listening," I said. Diana began. A reformulated version of everything. The debts were a misunderstanding. The loans were to cover household expenses she was too embarrassed to ask about. The conversation with Melissa was just venting between friends. The divorce was because she felt suffocated. There was no scheme. I was misreading everything. I was being paranoid. It was exactly the kind of distortion Forsyth had observed in the sessions. "Diana." I interrupted her gently. "Just the name." She stopped. I opened the folder I had brought with me. I calmly pulled out the sheets, the way I do when presenting an audit report, and placed them on the coffee table. "I heard everything," I said, "from the beginning." The silence that settled over that room was the kind that takes up physical space. Diana looked at the sheets. Melissa looked at Diana, and for a long moment, no one breathed. Melissa was the first to speak. "Nathan, you need to understand the context." "Melissa," I turned to her. "Your name is in a criminal complaint filed this morning. I recommend you call a lawyer before continuing that sentence." She closed her mouth. Diana tried again. Her voice broke for real this time, and I couldn't say with certainty whether it was genuine or just another layer of performance. But what she said was, "I was scared of the debts, of telling you. I panicked and made terrible decisions, and I know that, Nathan. I know. I know that you know," I said. "And now a judge will know too." She cried. Melissa sat motionless, and I sat in that armchair looking at the 2 women who had built a meticulous scheme to destroy me, watching the moment when every piece of their plan turned against them with the precision of a well-drafted contract. The police arrived 40 minutes later. I hadn't called them at that moment. It was a development already scheduled with Gerald, part of the protocol we had established. A detective named Ray Coburn, dry and professional, who knew the case and came to collect the initial statements. Melissa walked out the door of my house with an expression I will never forget. It wasn't anger, it was the expression of someone who had just understood that every step they had taken with confidence was a step someone had already mapped out beforehand. Diana stayed. There were legal matters to resolve that required her presence. She sat back down on the sofa, somehow smaller, as if the entire architecture she had built around herself had collapsed in real time. I felt no pleasure. I need to be honest about that. I felt something closer to exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of someone who carried the weight of a situation alone for weeks, unable to talk to anyone, unable to show anything, functioning as if everything were fine, while on the inside was rebuilding their own life, brick by brick. In the months that followed, the legal process ran its course. The criminal charges against Diana and Melissa were formalized. Derek Sohn was investigated for participation in the undervaluation scheme and lost his broker's license. The house stayed with me, not because I needed to win, but because it was my right and I had protected that right with documentation, not with impulse. The forged debts were reversed after a handwriting expert confirmed the signature forgeries. Gerald called me when the last document was signed. "It's over," he said. "It's over," I repeated. I stayed silent for a long time on that call. There was nothing to celebrate in the way people imagine. There was only the end of something that should never have existed and the beginning of the real work. Rebuilding the trust I had placed in the wrong place, relearning how to distinguish what is real from what is performance, understanding that the fact I was good at identifying fraud in contracts did not make me immune to being deceived by someone I loved. That's what no one talks about when it comes to betrayal. It's not just what the person did, it's what they destroyed in your capacity to believe. It's the quiet work of rebuilding yourself without closing yourself off completely from the world. I learned that justice is not automatic. It has to be built, documented, protected, that acting on impulse when you're angry hands the game to whoever wants to see you defeated, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet, observe, and wait. Not out of weakness, but because you already know how the story ends, and you're simply letting it write itself. And I learned above all that people who plan to destroy you generally count on your disorientation. They count on the pain making you slip up. When you don't slip up, when you breathe, document, and act at the right time, their own trap becomes the evidence against them. That's what happened. That's what I did. And if you made it this far, I want you to tell me in the comments which part of this video stuck with you the most. The moment I decided not to confront her? The therapy session? The day she filed and I was already ready? Tell me. Because every story we share here is a reminder that the truth, when documented with patience, always finds its way back.